Hey there! In this first episode of the new series of CAQDAS Chat with Christina, I'm chatting to Jack Bowen, who's one of the newer developers in the field of computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, and he focuses on harnessing generative AI for qualitative research. Jack's been building research tools using generative AI since graduating from University of Oxford in 2020. He co-founded Genie.io, which is an AI summarization tool aimed at students and academics. And he speaks a little bit about that in this episode. But a lot of what we chat about is CoLoop, which is a qualitative analysis tool which was launched just under 12 months ago now in March 2023. Jack and his co-founders were prompted to develop CoLoop as a result of their own experience conducting market and product research. And the tool is rapidly developing both in terms of functionality and user base. The episode notes have got links to Jack and his products, as well as to some of the sessions that I've done on CoLoop, which you might want to tap into. For now, let's head on over to the episode. So, Jack, thanks a lot. I'm really excited to continue the chats that we've been having for the last few months about your work in AI generally and specifically with CoLoop. But I wanted to start off, if it's okay, with a little bit about how you became interested in using computers for qualitative analysis in the first place. So you started with that quite quickly out of university, I think, didn't you? You graduated a few years ago from the University of Oxford, and then it was pretty much straight away that you started to develop these technologies. So can you speak a little bit about what sparked your interest? What motivated you to join this space back then?
Yeah, absolutely. So back when we first got going, we started building, research tools with AI. This was back in end of 2019 into 2020. We actually developed a product before called Genie, which was for summarizing academic papers. And a lot of the interest in Qual kind of came from working on that product and kind of scoping out that idea, the discovery interviews we did with people to understand what the problems were. And then once we built it, running interviews to understand how people were using it and what their experiences were like. And so through doing that, we found that Qual quickly became an enormously important tool for us to get very actionable and useful answers about our specific business problem around developing this product. Later, when we went on to kind of consider other ideas, other sort of software platforms, we also ran a lot of calls with different experts. So we actually considered a huge range of different industries while scoping out other ideas for software tools. We spoke to people in the shipping industry and finance, in all kinds of different sectors. And I think really what we kind of saw there was just the power of doing these kind of depth interviews and really understanding people's problems and how they can be solved. And so I think that sparked the interest. And from there, we then experienced the problem, which is that after you've conducted these things, you then end up with hours and hours worth of audio, and it's a gold mine of information, and there's some great stuff in there. But going through it all and trying to put together a narrative that you can bring back to the rest of your team that makes sense, that gets the buy-in from them, was a whole nother struggle in of itself. And so, I remember with a colleague, we would, stay up quite late into the evening with a whiteboard, kind of trying to figure out what the storyline was and searching things and control Fing and all the rest of it to look through these transcripts, trying to find validation for the ideas we thought we'd unearth. And so I think the idea for CoLoop really was born of that, seeing the immense use of Qual and how powerful it is, and then kind of experiencing firsthand the problems that come when you actually get to do it, and the issues of taking all these interviews and these great ideas and turning them into a good story that's got some good evidence to back it up.
Okay, so that's interesting. So is it mainly interviews and focus group discussions that people are using CoLoop for right now then?
That's kind of where it began. And then more recently, we've actually started to kind of branch out into helping people analyze other types of data. So we've built several integrations with tools like Recollective and Inkling. They were another kind of discovery that happened, I guess, later on into our journey. We were primarily used to doing a lot of interviewing, and as we started to work with more agencies and more researchers, online bulletin boards were obviously something that came up. I think they're a particularly interesting example of this problem too, because the unlike an interview with an online bulletin board, even though you're moderating it, you may not have necessarily done a full pass of all the data. They're typically larger in size. There's a lot of unseen information. They're much richer in terms of different media formats as well. So, oftentimes you're not just looking at text. There could be video, audio recordings, collages people have made. There's all kinds of really interesting activities that people do. And so I think it's a they're very information dense, but also a huge kind of exacerbation of the problem that you get with doing typical interviewing. And so that's something we're also pushing out into, and our kind of overall remit there is to kind of continue assisting qualitative researchers across all of the formats, languages and methodologies that they want to use.
Okay, so really exciting. It sounds to me like, I mean, when I think back to over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, how much has changed in this space. And I think, the symposium that we did at the end of last year that you were involved in, it was really interesting to see all of the different ideas and opportunities and, and also concerns and challenges, of course, as well. But, you allude to sort of audio and video, and I know that CoLoop has what I think is a really fantastic automated transcription tool, by the way. It seems to be really accurate, and the way that you can specify keywords and things that are likely to come up makes it, much more accurate, which is really great. But what do you see as being the opportunities in terms of using generative AI for video and audio that hasn't been transformed into text? That's technically a lot more tricky, obviously, but what's your thoughts about that?
So I think that the kind of emergence of models that can deal with other modalities is a really exciting topic. I remember I think it was around the middle of last year, looking at some of the work that Microsoft Asia were doing from the AI lab there, and doing things like visual question answering. And a lot of these models weren't released in production at that point. It was kind of the beginnings of what's now GPT-4 Vision. And some of the results they were getting were just astonishing. So, there were examples of people feeding in pictures of kind of logical mathematics tests, so like maths Olympiad questions around shapes and things, and just the image format with no text at all, and essentially having a model with visual capabilities actually being able to correctly answer that question and kind of get to the root of that problem. And so that's now that's now come out to production. It's used commercially in different tools. And so I think video and audio and other media formats is something that we're just going to see more and more of. I think some of the really interesting work also going on outside of the visual examples like that, visual question answering, is around sort of visual tagging. So typically that's been a huge problem if you're involved in any kind of behavioral or ethnographic work. The data you're dealing with doesn't always involve people speaking. So, you may do a study where all of it is observational and you're just watching what somebody's actions are, or you're asking them to send you pictures, for instance, of things in their daily life, and having to go through and tag all those and analyze them is a huge task. And I think the other modalities that AI models can now take in is a really interesting kind of step in being able to deal with quite a historically challenging problem. The other final example I talk about, so we've talked about visual QA and visual tagging. The final example that we're quite excited about too is also combining audio inputs with a transcript. So there are companies now at the moment that are actually working on essentially encoding the tone and the speech with the transcript tokens themselves, which would enable people to look at things like the tonality of how somebody said something, whether they sounded confident, whether they paused, whether they were uncertain. And so being able to actually start leveraging that as well is going to be really, really exciting.
So that's potentially going to transform what's possible, and not just how it's possible, but the scope of what's possible, and also who's involved in doing it, isn't it? I mean, that's super exciting, but also like from the academic context, I guess, where a lot of those who I've worked with over the years, there's a little bit of reticence and concern about these things. And I know that you've thought very deeply, haven't you, about the data privacy and confidentiality aspects of that. Can you speak a little bit about how you handle that in your tools right now? Because I think that's something that the audience of this podcast be super interested in. And then we'll think a little bit about how that might impact on what happens with the visual stuff later.
Yeah, definitely. So our approach to this, essentially, we've built our product mainly for research agencies from day one. So that's been a massive concern. Obviously, they're dealing with often very confidential client data, businesses that have problems that they're looking to solve that they may not want other people to be aware of. So we take it very, very seriously. We have a number of different features built in. We do encryption at rest and transit, all of the industry standards there. On top of that as well, we're also very explicit about which third parties we're using in our tool. And when you sign up, you can see a full list of them. Anyone that we do work with as a third party, we also bind into appropriate legal agreements so that they're not able to retain or passively train on anyone's data. And we sign those same agreements as well with all of our customers, just to really ensure that you know exactly where your data is going. And when you delete it, it is completely deleted and it's not being retained anywhere.
So how long does the data get kept for then in order to let the AI do its thing?
So that's something that you have control over. So for as long as the project is there, it will exist. And then once you delete it, it's completely wiped from everywhere. And I guess just to add to that as well, we work with a number of companies too in sensitive areas like government and healthcare, who we've kind of been very sort of collaborative with on kind of developing protocols here that work for everyone.
And you're able to choose where the data is stored, aren't you? When you set up a project in CoLoop, I can choose whether it's the UK, Europe, or the US. Is that right?
Yeah, so you can choose where the primary files get stored. So that's typically the highest classification of PII. Any of the derivative information that comes from that, so extracted transcripts, vectors, etc., are stored on servers that we operate in the US securely.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks for that. I think that will put a lot of people's minds at rest. But it also makes me think about what the kind of responses to this are. I mean, obviously, you've got a lot of people using your tool since that sort of the early days. How would you kind of summarize the kind of responses to these technologies in the qual space? What are people who are using your tools saying about how they're using them, but also how it's contributing to their process?
Is this through the lens of privacy or more kind of
No, more generally. So maybe privacy, but also sort of more methods terms as well. So I've always been really interested, Jack, in the relationship between methods and tools. So how methods can be enacted through the use of tools, but also how tools, the development of tools and new tools allow us to do different things methods wise. So that kind of dialectic. So
yeah,
those two things, I guess.
So I would say that in a super traditional setting, the approach would have been to go through and code a lot of data and to build up a code book and work collaboratively with people to kind of label everything within your data set and kind of look at the relationships and the concordance across all of them that way. What we found is that typically in more commercial research, the approach is much more hypothesis-led. Oftentimes, people, businesses, companies, governments, whoever your client is, a lot of the problems that they face are reasonably similar to ones that you would have seen before. And the focus a lot of the time is on the detail, the narrative, and getting buy-in from the team that you're kind of building the research to build a strategy for. So the way that they tend to work is much more hypothesis-led. Part of the reason for that, I would say, is to do with speed. In commercial research, often the precisely right answer in the wrong amount of time can be just as unhelpful as the wrong answer in a much shorter amount of time. And so a hypothesis-led approach where people kind of have a pass of the data, have a discussion, a brainstorm, see what they kind of suspect is the case, what their intuition is, and then iteratively test and refine that is much more common. The way the CoLoop works and our tool works is very supportive of that kind of approach. And so some commercial researchers who formerly were using coding approaches have kind of switched over now more towards this hypothesis-led approach. It's not so much a new method. I think there are a lot of people who would have worked that way anyway previously. It's certainly something that that we did when we were, or when we still do, when we're kind of reviewing feedback interviews, that kind of thing. But I think that generative AI has been very sort of helpful in enabling people to work in an agile manner, where it can propose a solution quickly, allow you to explore it further, or test a hypothesis and go and search for validation for it.
So would you say that AI tools or generative AI tools are particularly well placed for that kind of hypothesis-led type of qual research then? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I would say that ours particularly is. You can approach it from, there are tools that are using generative AI to push more of a traditional coding approach. As far as I'm aware, I don't know of anyone that's managed to make that work particularly well for qualitative interviewing. I've seen reasonable implementations for coding survey open ends across some common categories. I don't think I've seen one yet that works particularly well for like long form narrative research material.
So you allude to other people, other tools in this space, and actually it's quite a crowded space, I would say. So I've been involved in this field for, I don't know, more than 25 years anyway, long time, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of the number and types of tools that are available. And the way I see it at the moment is it's kind of mushrooming in terms of what's not just what's possible, but what's available. And I wonder how you think about that in the kind of longer term. How do you see, do you see that it will settle down in terms of perceptions of these tools, and also the tools that kind of maintain their place in the space, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think in terms of the settling of it, I think that in the not too distant future, qual and AI is going to be pretty inseparable. I think it's going to be a very key tool in everyone's toolbox, and so I think the perceptions of it will settle. On the privacy point, I think it feels very, very sort of visceral. I think people's reaction to it, like the point around data privacy and storage, for instance, there are a lot of services we use today already. Google Mail, Google Drive, Dropbox, all these kinds of services that very much host a lot of our data. Most of those companies also have an AI program that they're working on, and there's nothing really that stops them from deciding one day that they're going to change their terms and conditions and start using your data for something. Zoom is actually a great example. We're conducting this on a Zoom call right now. A couple of months ago, they changed their privacy policy and basically to enable them to start gathering and training on data they use in the platform. That was U-turned quite quickly, but I thought it was just a good example of how the fear about AI companies specifically is no different to the hesitation anyone should have around using any kind of tech service that's cloud-based. So much so that I think a lot of them, if you looked into it, you'd probably find are actually storing data in the same data centers as each other, and it's not hugely different.
So a lot of that's to do with what people know about how it works and works in the back end in that respect, isn't it? And we make a whole bunch of assumptions about things, and this kind of like, oh, I've got to upload my data and the AI is doing its thing, and that's kind of very scary. But maybe a lot of our data is already at risk in that way anyway. So a lot of it's to do with perceptions, I guess, isn't it? And do you see that you have a role as a company developing these tools to raise awareness about those sorts of things, as well as kind of selling the tools?
I think, yeah, I'd probably just respond to the first point that I don't think it's all at risk already. I'd say that it's at risk in the same way as technologies that have a long track record of being quite careful about how they've used it. So I would say I think we do have a role. I think a lot of the misconception comes from the fact that people know that the L in ML stands for learning and it's machine learning, and somehow there is some sort of process that is possible with these things that involves updating their behavior with data you provided. And there's a very clear distinction between training, gradient descent, and actual inference. Inference doesn't residually retain any data. It merely involves a pass of your information through the system, and it isn't retained. Training is a very intensive and consuming process that does end up retaining data. And so I think, yeah, definitely I see us as having a role, not least of all as it's productive to our mission as a company to make it really easy for people to add AI to their research projects. And I think part of that responsibility is also very clearly outlining the risks or actual, I suppose, risks or
The safeguards against the risks,
guards
I
and
guess.
understanding of what's
Yeah,
going on basically with your data.
yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Can we go back a step? Because you started off with Genie, which was a summarization tool for research papers. Is that right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so the focus was more on academic context. Is that fair? Or
Yeah, very much so. We started that product because as when I met my other co-founders, we were working on our master's degrees at the time, and the biggest sort of problem we had was reading research papers, and so that was kind of the genesis of Genie and what really got us interested in AI.
can you tell us a little bit about how that works then? Is that available for people to use?
It is, yeah. It's very simple. It's you just kind of log into the website and get a trial or a subscription and upload a paper, and it will give you a bullet summary that you can click on and link to the supporting evidence. I think it was a really interesting experience, especially kind of seeing this whole the generative AI boom and how it's kind of grown up. Back when we first started, people had absolutely no idea what we were talking about. It was GPT-2 back then. It could barely string together a sentence that made sense. A lot of the models for summarization were extractive, so they would kind of summarize a document by removing wholesale sentences that didn't contribute to the meaning. I think when we began, the technology honestly was perhaps only just approaching a level of maturity where it was beginning to be useful. And I think that it's been fascinating kind of watching something that began as an incredibly niche area suddenly balloon into something that's kind of now affecting basically every single industry in society.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I think about some of the other kind of really fundamental developments, back in the past that didn't necessarily receive the same traction that they could or maybe should have done, depending on your perception.
Yeah.
Whereas now we're in a very different space. And I, reflected quite a lot recently on how that's probably partly to do with the fact that generative AI is everywhere and everybody knows about it and everybody's using it in some way or interested in it in some way
Yeah.
or whatever. Whereas that wasn't the case with other sort of developments in the qual space previously. So not everybody knew about, for example, if you take sentiment analysis as an example, right? The kind of traction around that was much less than we're seeing now, and a lot of people had access to those tools and weren't using them, for whatever reason. But we're in a completely different place now, with the kind of infiltration of generative AI everywhere, and I think that's potentially one of the reasons why it's going to have such a big impact on qual. Would you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard now to remember a time when people didn't know about it. I think the we did a fundraise in 2021, and I remember speaking to investors then, and they're probably an interesting litmus test to reflect on, because a lot of the responses and the pushback we got from people was, does this stuff actually work? Are these outputs actually good? Is this useful? Can I trust it? And I don't think those questions, if I went back to those same people now, not a single one of them would be asking us that. I think at the time, though, it was still very tentative, and I don't think people quite saw it. I think the thing that's changed is an enormous step up in its functionality and just capabilities that are far exceeding what they were back then. I mean, the development of it has just been explosive in terms of how quickly it's come on, and I think that's going to continue to accelerate, not least of all because from what we see, more and more people are now getting involved at the research level as well. so many more PhDs are starting in machine learning and applying generative AI. More companies are funding it. There's more interest in developing tools. Most of the startups that we spoke to and interacted with when we got going, a very small of them were doing things with generative AI. The majority weren't. And now if you kind of look at any sort of startup community, I would say that almost the vast majority involves some kind of AI at some point.
But that pace of development is challenging for you in terms of your tool, isn't it? Because you want to keep up with that pace, I guess. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a software developer, but you need to know what's happening technologically, and you need to think about how you might be able to harness that in your tool in a way that's going to be useful to your customers and to the kind of the field of doing good quality research, right? And that must be quite a challenging thing to grapple with, I would imagine, if the pace is kind of so fast.
Yeah, I think I think it can be at times. I'd say that the key bottleneck, at least I've seen so far, is still kind of product based and around thinking about how to apply them. I think that the technological capabilities of these things are far ahead of all the use cases we've thought of so far to actually use them for. And I think I'd love to see more people considering that. I think particularly among some researchers, I've seen a couple of sort of publications and posts and various other things where people are kind of fretting about how generative AI will impact the industry as it is currently, and discussing a lot of the shortcomings of it around hallucinations or context lengths or consistency. I think that all of those things are they're very active areas of development. They're sort of bugs with what we have currently, but I think they will be quite quickly fixed. And I'd love to see more thinking around what the possibilities are that unlocks and how it's going to change people's research for the better, rather than, I suppose, kind of worrying about how it may affect what we do right now, I guess.
That's interesting. That makes me think about the relationship between the human interpretation and what the AI is doing. Can you speak a little bit about how you handle that? How, if I'm using CoLoop, when and how and to what extent can I, as a human interpreter, say, actually, that's not quite what I meant? Or can you, how do you kind of manage that interaction between the human and the machine?
I think that, yeah, the key thing really is getting people explainability, interpretability, and trust in the results. And people should really be engineering tools in a manner that is human centric. And there is a kind of idea of human-centered AI, which is very much that you build your products in a fashion that enables that. The notion of a co-pilot is that they are junior to you and you are the one in the driving seat, and it's helping you by removing mundane activities. And that's a design ethos that we very much try to embrace with CoLoop. A lot of the way it's set up is always to give you citations. It's not set up to give you kind of assertions about what's the case. You're always able to check. You're always able to see estimates for how many people said something, and you're always able to click through and see the evidence. And so I think building something that's human-centric like that is not only sensible, but it's actually also a better way of working, because it actually enables the human researcher using it to make best use of what they're good at, what their skill sets are, which from what I see, often accommodates for the shortcomings that we might see with generative AI.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the new things I've seen when I've been using it recently is the ability to upvote and downvote when the co-pilot generates some insights for you. And is it then learning from that? So is that an aspect of how it will improve as you go?
So we don't do any kind of training with that data. So what we do with that information is we aggregate it across everyone. So we work with over 90 consultancies and agencies, and what we do is we take all of that information and we track it as a KPI along with other behavioral cues around whether people click through on evidence, whether they regenerate them, whether they open it up to go look at the transcripts, whether they scroll down the evidence panel to check out the rest of the evidence. And what that allows us to do is have a metric that we can track in terms of how well we're doing at generating useful value for people.
Okay. So it's not training the
No.
AI to do the job better. It's about you understanding how people are using your tool and what's useful to them or not.
Absolutely. And I think
Okay.
what's also interesting is that what we found is that as the best way to improve our offering is actually just qualitatively still going and speaking to people about what their experiences are like. So if we see somebody's downloading a lot of messages, we'll reach out, we'll get on a call with them, and we'll kind of see if they can show us some examples if they feel comfortable doing that, and talk to them about what they would want to get out of it. And by doing that process, I mean that's been more valuable than any kind of quantitative metric or kind of abstract way of measuring these things. And so fundamentally going back to it and talking to the user and getting them to explain their experiences is still really core to what we do.
All right, great, thanks. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the tools you've developed and your thoughts on privacy and how they're being used and those sorts of things. I just wanted to ask you what you would say to those who remain reticent about the use of these tools. So if someone came to you and said, Jack, I'm really concerned about this. This is not, doesn't fit in with my model of how I think qual should be done. What would your response to that be?
I would say try it out. Go and experiment. Research is all about breaking new ground, and I think that what we saw. I mean, we launched our. I mean, we launched our paid product literally first users back in March of last year, and I think there was kind of an arc that we watched people go on. There was a lot of mistrust and honestly hysteria to some extent around people's concerns around what this was going to mean. And I think the thing that assuaged that the most was when people actually just tried the tool and thought, hold on a minute, this is not taking away what I like, it's just taking away the legwork, the kind of initial grunt work that I have to do when I'm chopping up and preparing my data. And actually by using these kinds of tools and approaches, I get to think more, and I get to do less research admin, and the final outputs I produce, the conclusions I come to are stronger and they're more insightful.
So it sounds to me like you're saying that you'd advocate making informed decisions about these things rather than just panicking about it.
Yeah, go and try them out. They're not that scary. I think that you will understand by doing that what their limits actually are right now and what they can do for you. And I think that honestly, pretty much everyone, when they have a go, whether it's our tool or not, I think you kind of you begin to appreciate what it does. And I think the people who have the most concern about it, the ones who probably use them the least and are kind of in the echo chamber of LinkedIn, Goldman Sachs's 6 million job lost or whatever. I think that's the key message. I would say just go and try it out.
I think that's probably the same message that we've been seeing over the last 30 years. When qualitative software first became available, most of the criticisms from that was coming from people who weren't using it. And so I guess that's just generally true of tech, isn't it? Whether it's analysis or not.
Yeah, it's any new movement faces that. I think Facebook's also an interesting example. Like, Mark Zuckerberg at the time was an avid blogger, writing about his life and posting that to the public internet was completely normal to him and totally weird to everybody else. That was a deeply, deeply strange thing to go and do. And now it's very common for people to go and do that. And I think it's the behavioral arc of adopting any technology. It's weird at the beginning, and before you know it, everyone does it.
There's a really cool website that I've found, which it's completely left my mind right now, but I'll dig it out and put it in the episode notes, where they show like snippets of horror that people felt about various tech, going back hundreds of years, about things which are now completely normalized, and like why were people worried about that? It's quite fun to go and look at that archive. It's a little archive of newspaper snippets and stuff. So it's the same sort of idea, isn't it? It's quite fun.
Interesting. Yeah, the other one that I know I've heard of is the Gutenberg press, and the Catholic Church back at the time being very concerned about how it was going to spread disinformation and corrupt thought if people were able to produce pamphlets on mass, and so they were very against having a publishing industry that circumvented the church and the monasteries.
Yeah, yeah, really fascinating. All right, okay, thanks. I want to, so you've spoken about tools generally as well as your own, but I just wondered what, if you had to say there was one thing that you're most proud about in terms of CoLoop, what would that be?
It's a good question. Interesting. I think I think one thing that I'm very proud of, that I suppose is a common mistake for companies starting out, is the fact that I would say we've been very disciplined about remaining focused on what we're doing. There have been a lot of temptations along the way to build cool things or stuff that seems interesting based on newer things that have come out. And I think by being very committed to our core mission and our core customers, and like really focusing on qualitative researches, I think we've just seen a lot of benefits from doing that, and specialization. I think it's also an important message in that, you mentioned the space is crowded, and, I agree with you. And I think that definitely the antidote to that, and the way to bring most value, is to just be very, very clear about who you're helping and help them as much as you possibly can, and go as deep as possible into solving their specific problems.
So be really good at one thing rather than sort of mediocre at multiple things. I say that to students a lot,
Exactly.
about their dissertations, right? Answer one question really well, even if it's a very narrow, specific question, rather than trying to do everything. I was very bad at that when I was doing my PhD, I have to say.
Yeah,
But
exactly. I think there are essentially folks developing out there who are moving very horizontally, and I think that it's kind of a sort of, for us at least, it doesn't seem like the kind of approach that's going to end well for providing maximum value to a key customer segment.
Mm, mm. Cool. Okay, we're coming to the end. I've got a few more questions, if that's all right. We've talked a little bit about the past, and we've talked a little bit about some of the potential for the future. I wondered whether you're able, and you might not be able to share with us any ideas about where CoLoop's going in the future. Is there anything coming up that you're able to let us know about that will whet our appetites?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we are most excited about, that's becoming quite core to what we're doing, is integrations. So Qual is very varied. It's, there are so many different ways to collect data. There are so many great tools out there, and depending on your audience or the question that you're trying to answer, it can vary which service you might want to use for that. As an example, I spoke to a research firm who work a lot in developing and also war-torn countries, and for them, gathering data through like WhatsApp-based tooling is actually most effective and gets them the best response rates and the richest data. For other folks who are working in consumer, again, ethnographic approaches with mobile are better for people in B2B research. Sitting down on a laptop works for them. And so what we're very excited about, and what's core to our mission in the next couple of months, is actually just building plugins and integrations for a lot of these services, so that if there's one that you like, or there's one that you like to use for a type of project, it's just going to plug really easily into CoLoop and allow you to apply some AI analysis straight out the gate really quickly. So far, we've built out 2, Inkling and Recollective, and we've got a lot more coming.
So that speaks specifically to your core market in terms of where you developed CoLoop, in terms of agencies. But you do have academics and non-agency qual researchers using your tool as well, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we certainly do. And again, I'd say the same applies really. The tooling that you use is a matter of partially preference, and also partially what audience you're trying to reach.
Cool. Okay, so I've got 2 questions which I want to finish up with, which you might know if you've listened to any of the other podcasts. I ask everybody just so that we can have a little bit of comparative data. over the years. So the first one of those, Jack, is this one. If you had to pinpoint one moment in the past that had changed the course of computer-assisted qual analysis, what would that be?
Interesting. I'm trying to think of a more interesting answer than the really obvious answer of GPTs or the transformer. Uh, I think okay. I think taking a step back, I would say that one of the things that has changed the industry forever is an innovation that happened in core AI around reinforcement learning, and the ability to distill human preference. I think that as a training technique took models that performed okay to heights that were previously beyond people's imagination. Reinforcement learning is a technique which allows you to take an AI model and align its outputs towards the preference of humans, and that was really the kind of key that took OpenAI from GPT-3, which was okay, to GPT 3.5 and then 4, which are orders of magnitude better. And so I think being able to do that and those techniques have been a really interesting development that's trickled down to Qual and applying AI to it.
So for some of my audience who might not know when that happened, is that something that happened relatively recently, right? In the last...
It's been around for a while as a technique, particularly for providing suggestions. So if you're on a shopping website, if you get suggested items that you might want
Yeah.
to look at, that would have been based on models trained with reinforcement learning. The real innovation was from OpenAI figuring out a way to actually apply that to language models, and a way to basically measure and encode the preference of your your set of data labelers, and then to tune a language model to produce outputs that align more closely with what they would prefer.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Okay, so the second question that's going to everyone is this one. So looking to the future rather than the past, what is one thing that you think needs to happen in our field of computer-assisted qual to further advance what we can do methodologically? So what would be your desire, even if you don't know how to make it happen?
My desire for qual to make it advance methodologically, I think I'm going to say my instinctive reaction to that is a behavioral shift and an optimism towards tools. I'm going to go back to the point that I made earlier. There's a lot of content and writing out there around people kind of trying to highlight the shortcomings or the issues with AI tools and generative AI. I think they're very well documented, and I think that the limitations are increasingly better understood. I think that what I'd love to see is more thinking around what happens after that point, and what types of new studies we can run, what types of questions we can answer now that we couldn't before. And I think a sort of a relaxation and optimism and some excitement for the future and some thinking about what's going to be possible that wasn't in the past.
Okay, so a mindset shift rather than a tech shift. That's interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Because as
cool.
I say,
Okay.
I think the technology is far in advance of all of the ideas we've thought of for how to use it, and that's where I see the progress to be made.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, I'm going to do one more cheeky question. Okay, this is a question which I heard on some other completely unrelated podcast a few weeks ago, which I thought was a great question. So I'm stealing it. So I've known you for, I don't know, 6 months, 9 months, something like that. If I knew you better, Jack, what question would I have asked you?
Gosh, what question would you have asked if you knew me better? I don't know, maybe I suppose like what's the most sort of surprising uh surprising experience or discovery that we've made during our kind of journey of building this tool.
Okay, good question. So what's the answer then, Jack?
Yeah, I think the most I think the most surprising thing I'd say for us is that I think it's the speed of learning and adoption that people have actually managed to achieve with these tools. I would say that a number of people in research are perhaps more senior, and they've kind of been around for a lot longer, and so like and I think that as a technological shift, it's like definitely one that's closer to the forefront. And I think the speed with which people have actually picked these things up when they've committed to them and learn how to use them really effectively has been really really great to see. And it's something that I think we were initially concerned about, around how we were going to make something that's simple enough to use, but people really seem to be cottoning onto it and taking a real interest in prompt engineering and the fundamentals and like how it works. So I think that's been a pleasant surprise.
Great, cool. All right, Jack, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, good luck with everything moving forward. I'm really excited to see how it continues to develop, and I've really enjoyed using it and telling people about it and teaching it in workshops and stuff. So thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Fantastic. And thanks so much for having me. And I look forward to the next episode.